the honourable member for Lakeland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'll split my time with the member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes. The most recent report of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians confirmed what security officials, academics, activists, dissidents, and many elected representatives have been warning for years, that China is one of the, quote, most significant long-term threats to Canada's sovereignty and prosperity, and is increasingly targeting Canada's health, science, and technology sector. In the US in January last year, the chair of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard University was charged in relation to his activities as a so-called strategic scientist at the Wuhan University of Technology in China and as a contractual participant in the Thousand Talents Plan, China's massive attraction, recruitment, and cultivation program of high-level scientific talent to the benefit of China's scientific development, economic prosperity, and national security. It lures Chinese talent overseas and foreign experts to China for their knowledge and experience and offers rewards for stealing proprietary information. The Canadian NSICOP report says China transfers intellectual property and technologies like AI, quantum technology, 5G, and biopharma from other countries for China's military in particular. Last summer, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service cautioned Canada's universities and research institutions that China uses academic recruitment programs to obtain cutting-edge science, research, and technology capacity for the regime's economic and military advantage. A CSIS spokesperson said it's at the expense of Canada's national interest and intellectual property capacity, quote, including jobs, revenue for public services, and a diminished competitive global advantage. A Carleton University professor says CSIS has briefed more than 400 companies and research organizations comprising 2,000 individuals in universities, the private sector, and research fields, including 40 universities across Canada, all 15 main research universities among them, about this threat. In January here in Canada, just 4 months ago, and a year after the charges of the Harvard professor and 2 Chinese nationals in the U.S., Dr. Xianggo Chu, the head of vaccine development and antiviral therapies, and her husband, biologist Dr. Keding Cheng, were fired from the Public Health Agency of Canada, having been removed from their work in the special pathogens section of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg in the summer of 2019. CSIS had urged PHAC to revoke the scientists' clearances along with an unknown number of Dr. Chu's students because of national security concerns around their work with China's Wuhan Institute of Virology. Winnipeg's lab is not an ordinary one. It's Canada's top infectious disease facility. The Winnipeg and the Wuhan lab have level 4 scientific designations equipped to deal with the world's deadliest and most dangerous viruses. It's important to consider the level of the Canadian security clearances held by the government-funded researchers and students who were escorted out of Winnipeg's lab in 2019. Canadian security clearance is granted under 3 categories: reliability status, secret clearance, and top secret clearance, all which require identity verification and assessments of personal backgrounds, educational and professional credentials, personal and professional references, and credit and criminal record checks. Due to the top-level information to which secret and top secret clearances enable access, subjects undergo a more extensive examination of the previous decade of their activity and a meticulous assessment of reliability and/or loyalty to Canada by CSIS. Secret clearances are valid for 10 years and top secret for only 5. What's known without doubt is that a number of scientists from the Winnipeg lab collaborated with scientists from China over several years. Close work between scientists in the Winnipeg and Wuhan labs have resulted in co-published papers and involved trips of scientists from the Winnipeg lab to China and to Wuhan in particular. There's been association and collaboration with Chinese military scientists, including their access to the Winnipeg lab. It's clear that it's fair to say that the Winnipeg lab did help to build the capacity of the Wuhan lab, and it's known that the Winnipeg lab did ship Ebola and Hennepa viruses to the Wuhan Virology Institute 4 months before the couple was expelled from the lab. But other than those facts, there are a whole lot more questions than answers. The Public Health Agency of Canada, which has had an outsized role and extraordinary impact on everyday Canadians' lives during the past year and a half, has withheld hundreds of pages of documents related to the information and reasons for firing the 2 scientists despite repeated requests from MPs. PHAC says it's, quote, obligated to safeguard sensitive information, particularly in the context of national security and employee privacy. But Conservatives are asking for transparency because Canadians must be able to have confidence that the federal government has protected Canada's national security and the safety and security of all Canadians. This disclosure will both help assure Canadians it has done so and allow elected representatives to ensure accountability and determine any policy or legislative gaps or improvements required. The Conservative proposal for the House of Commons law clerk to review the material and meet confidentially with MPs on the Special Canada-China Committee and redact anything that might harm national security or interfere with a criminal investigation before it's made public is responsible, prudent, and conscientious. I have to say personally, having questioned PHAC representatives about the disastrous, unfounded, costly hotel quarantine debacle at alleged sexual assault, I'm very concerned with what has evolved to be the wide scope and scale of PHAC's power over the lives, livelihoods, families, and businesses of everyday Canadians without much transparency, accountability, checks, or scrutiny. In that committee, responses were as prepared, repeated, evasive, and slick as any skilled politicians, and on at least one occasion, answers given to a different questioner later in the meeting directly contradicted earlier responses on the same subject. Requests for information were obfuscated. There were half-hearted claims that additional material, like the actual evidence and facts to justify and perpetuate a particular policy, would be forthcoming, but were never delivered. So Canadians rightfully want answers, and Canadians are reasonably skeptical about what appears to be an opaque institution with remarkable influence and authority over them, in which it seems turmoil and challenges have been obscured. The head of the lab, the president, and 2 executives have also quit during the past several months. That's why MPs should enable transparency and clarity for all Canadians by compelling PHAC to release the information it's withholding. Now, some might question whether this issue merits all this attention and being elevated for debate for an entire day after months of work at a dedicated committee. Well, the warnings in NCCOP reports from CSIS, from the RCMP, and media reporting about China's growing and complicated influence and intimidation campaigns around the world explain the gravity. Conservatives are trying to get Canadians answers about what's happened here and at the top lab, and PHAC officials report to the health minister. Experts are pleading for legislators, and especially in free democracies, to recognize and combat the ever-increasing reach of China's communist regime. China manipulates and basically secures ownership of poor countries by building critical infrastructure they can't afford. China victimizes its own citizens and threatens, coerces, and bullies expats for the economic, knowledge, and military benefit of the regime. In 1 year, China coerced 680 people worldwide with stark options: return or kill yourself. Families in China are harassed, threatened, and arrested to enforce compliance. Canada's intelligence says this operation is even carried out here in our CMP offices. The US has made several arrests, while Canadian cabinet ministers and officials simply say more must be done. China engages in influence campaigns on politicians worldwide and in economic warfare against developed countries that implement policies to protect their own sovereignty and security. China derides free media and infiltrates social media with millions of state-sponsored actors to spread disinformation for the regime and against detractors. China methodically carries out foreign interference and espionage and infiltrates free democracies, threatening the cyber, economic, intellectual, and personal security and liberty of citizens. China expands its state-owned companies into the IT and communications networks of countries worldwide, violates privacy, and mandates reporting of information back to China's regime and military, and uses apps and online services for surveillance and monitoring. Last year in the US, more than 1,000, quote, high-risk graduate students and research scholars were expelled from universities to counter a, quote, wide-ranging and heavily resourced campaign to acquire sensitive US technologies and intellectual property, in part to bolster the modernization and capability of its military. In 2018, an Australia think tank studied co-authored peer-reviewed papers by China's military scientists and overseas researchers. 3 Canadian universities are in the top 10. That year, the former director of CSIS warned that China views Canada as a, quote, easier target. So this clearly should get Canadians' attention and serious urgency from Canadian MPs because Canadians are vulnerable. But this Prime Minister admires China's basic dictatorship, won't name the genocide of the Uyghurs, had an ambassador hold a retreat near concentration camps, gave tens of millions to China for vaccine research and Huawei research projects, hasn't banned Huawei like all of Canada's allies, had a foreign affairs minister financed by the state-run Bank of China, and calls anyone who asks questions conspiracy theorists and racists, all while China literally detains Canadians. Parliament must do its job, since this Prime Minister won't.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, there was a day in which the Conservative Party, under Prime Minister Stephen Harper at the time, would say that there were limitations, that there was a need to protect privacy and at our special committees and standing committees. And somewhere between then and the Conservatives losing office and becoming a part of an opposition, and their burning desire to politicize, the Conservative Party seems to say that everything's off the table. And this is the question I have for the member. Today, is the Conservative Party's position opposite of what Stephen Harper said, and that being that a standing committee can ask and receive any documents completely unredacted? Are there situations where redaction is, in fact, acceptable under the new Conservative leadership?
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Here is what one part of the motion that Conservatives have put forward today, which we are debating, says. The law clerk and parliamentary counsel shall review the documents with a view to redacting information which could reasonably be expected to compromise national security or reveal details of an ongoing criminal investigation other than the existence of an investigation. And the motion says that the law clerk would meet confidentially with MPs on the Canada-China committee, and no information would be released that would compromise Canada's national security or a criminal investigation. So I would ask the member opposite why it is that his government is working so hard, bending over backwards all day today, and like a colleague said earlier today, taking up a much-needed day of debate rather than other issues to cover up what obviously they must be trying to hide.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Avignon-Lamitis, Madame Matabidia. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for the speech and also for work on the Public Safety Committee. It's very pleasant to work with her. You know, the government never gave any explanation about what happened, nor did PHAC, despite the fact that the committee has asked for that information many times. And here we are. Now the House has to force the government to give this information. So would my colleague not agree that people have the right to know and that it is the responsibility of the federal government to make this information public? Thank you.
Member for Lakeland.
Thank you to my colleague for her question, and I share the same sentiments as about our work together on the Public Safety Committee, and I think she's an extremely capable member of Parliament. Absolutely, I agree, and Conservatives agree wholeheartedly that Canadians deserve answers, and it is the job of members of Parliament to get those answers. I think it is quite mind-boggling that an agency has refused repeated requests from a committee of members of Parliament, and I think it's regrettable that obviously the Liberal government is enabling that agency to continue to withhold that information. So I agree completely. It is the responsibility of MPs to ensure that information gets released without compromising national security, and Canadians deserve those answers.
Brief question, the Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep it brief, is because one of the things that's a concern here is Asian hate crime, and discussion of this creates a sensitivity that I think is very important. So what do the Conservatives propose to do during this to ensure that we do not have that continuation? We've seen it across North America, and we witness this across our riding. So during this issue, it's really about non-democratic governments and their involvement as opposed to individuals in Canada here. What do they suggest to actually augment these arguments against this as a tool?
A brief answer from the member for Lakeland.
Thank you to the member for his question. Obviously, Conservatives wholeheartedly believe that in criminal activities and hate crimes, the full force of the law and consequences for perpetrators must be meted out. On the other hand, I think it is also does a disservice to all people, and particularly people who are Chinese citizens or from China, to for example, federal government ministers to allege that asking questions about this information can be equated to bigotry, and actually in so doing empowers and enables an autocratic, hostile state regime, which makes their own citizens and people around the world vulnerable.